Welcome back to the podcast, and I suppose we're having a fast run to the end of our series on William Bartley and his book, The Retreat to Commitment. We're on the 5th appendix, and this is about the criticizability of logic, or at least the charge against Bartley that he does have presuppositions within his argument that exist beyond criticism. Now, he did briefly discuss this earlier on in the text itself, but he does feel the need here to play it out in an entire chapter of its own, simply because I think, and this also struck my ear when I first read it earlier on in the chapter, this was many years ago, as a kind of hypocrisy from Bartley. He's saying throughout the book that nothing should be beyond criticism, including criticism itself. And then he seems to say, but logic, the principle of logic itself, exists beyond criticism. But rather than have me give you a lengthy introduction here, let's see what Bartley says and let's walk through the chapter together. And he does begin with a question just like that. The question he starts the chapter with is, what are the presuppositions of argument? Or are there any presuppositions of argument itself? And traditionally, at least from that school, that synthetic analytic school, the school that Bartley came out of before he went overseas and met Popper, this is when Quine was his teacher. The idea is that when you bring an argument forward, when you bring forward a belief that you have about the world and you criticize it, no part of it should exist beyond revision, or does exist beyond revision. None of it is insulated in any way. You can't say in advance, sure, the mistake may be in these areas, but not in this particular one. And Bartley does give a semblance of respect here to his former school and his former teachers. And he does say that there are senses in which logic is not only open to revision, but indeed has been revised. The example he has here is Aristotelian logic, a formulation of logic where things were pushed into categorical propositions. And Bartley says quite rightly that we abandon this. The history of philosophy, the history of logic abandoned this simply because it was too cumbersome. It restricted too much. But that's not really what Bartley is talking about here. And that's not really the hang-up that people who see that Bartley is holding on to a presupposition are worried about. The real question is more the principle of logic, not a specific type of logic. And that is, and this is Bartley's quote, the question arises whether logic can be revised in the sense of denying the true premises always must lead in any valid inference to true conclusions. So sure, he's holding on to a type of logic which is, and was, fashionable at the time. And I believe he, of course, is opening the question that if you want to criticize the form of logic, fine. But the existence of logic, not so much. The trouble with trying to argue against logic itself, or the fact that logic ought to be revisable, is this, that when you do that, you're presupposing logic. If you run a test and then insist that you revise your standard or you revise your theory or your presuppositions based on that test, well, this presupposes the notion of deducibility. Also the idea of the transmissibility of falsehood. You've run the test and the conclusions have extracted a falsehood which then should be passed back to the premises. And, of course, this runs both ways. Falsity is transmitted from premises to conclusion as well. When we talk about this particular type of logic, the logic that exists in most people's minds today when they think about formal practice of logic at universities, it's a fairly minimal standard of logic, one that Bartley calls a theory of derivation, demonstration, and refutation. But of course, if when we do a test and we seek a revision afterwards, if we are using logic within that argument itself, within that process, then not all of logic can be under test. We can test parts of logic, but we're using some logic to test logic. And the thing we're using can't be under test. There must exist a difference between what is under revision at any particular moment and what is used to bring that thing under revision. So perhaps the question comes back to Bartley, just how much of logic is presupposed by that idea of deducibility, which is basically the transmissibility of falsehood. When searching for a revisability criteria of a kind, Bartley thinks this goes back to the heart of what he's been doing throughout, particularly the part where he speaks about the need of an ecological niche, particularly now the ecological purpose of arguing in the first place. And of course this is to expose one's views as severely as possible to the possibility of being wrong. That is to make things difficult for our positions. This minimal logic, whatever it is that must sustain, must exist beyond criticizability in any given argument. Well, what would it look like? Bartley says it must have at least two characteristics, of course. It must include the law of non-contradiction and the law of the excluded middle. The non-contradiction law is fairly straightforward. If, for example, you allowed contradictions to exist, then it wouldn't be possible to transmit falsity, and criticism would be impossible. This is the heart of why Bartley, in particular, is so keen on introducing pancritical rationalism, because he thought there was a contradiction, a logical sidestep within the heart of critical rationalism. And if you allowed contradictions, then you allow everything. The law of the excluded middle is something you can reduce to informal logical language. It's either A or not A. That is, there's no other option here. You're running a test and it is either this or not this. It can't be any third option. So there's no middle ground here. So you exclude the middle. That's the basic formalization of that. Now, the law of non-contradiction, whenever you have it, it's a way of heightening criticism. If we discover a contradiction, well, we have a prima facie criticism of our theory. And if you abandon it, well, you'll limit or minimize the possibility of criticism. When it comes to the law of the excluded middle, well, Bartley does give an option here that in some cases it can be dispensed with. But it has the same purpose. It's heightening criticism. Sure, occasionally it can be used as a furphy to weaken criticism. The example Bartley used is institutionalist logic, where they abandon the law of the excluded middle, so that theorems of institutional logic insist that they are proved by weaker means than the available classical logic. This is a way of saying that indirect proof is ruled out, so no statement can be admitted unless it can be directly proved by producing an instance or an infinite determinate number of steps. Now, not much holds on that. It's not important here. But what happens is when people do make these exclusions, what they are doing often is trying to protect their theories, make them harder to criticize. And these types of decisions often come about in defense of other less tenable positions, such as the old logical positivist position of the need for verification or a principle of verification. By insisting on such a position, which of course is untenable, it leads us to go on to ignore or remove or reject the need of the law of the excluded middle. Once you insist on something that you can't achieve, like a verification principle, well, you're fairly distracted as a philosopher or as a scientist, and you've limited your ability to solve the problem in front of you. And you make all sorts of other ad hoc addendums after that, or at least it often leads in such directions. The revisability criteria, that sort of minimal logic that Bartley wants to advocate for here, as necessary in all circumstances, is unrevisable, but unrevisable in the sense that there are no circumstances, logical or otherwise, in which you could abandon it without also weakening the whole possibility of criticism itself. The claim in simple language that Bartley is getting at here is that if you ever have an instance where you have critical argument, well, that requires logic. You can't have critical argument without logic. And of course, this logic ought to be as minimal as possible, that allows revisability and criticism at its highest level. But logic does define the space in which all argument must take place. And then you find yourself in a kind of tautology. How can you argue yourself out of argument? Now, of course, you can begin to see why some of the defenders of critical rationalism or the opponents of pancritical rationalism had a slight problem with this, at least this formalization when they first heard it. How can I argue myself out of argument? Often can sound to the ear similar to how can I criticize myself out of criticism? Now, as Bartley said earlier, there are clearly ways to argue people out of certain types of logic. So it's not that logic is unrevisable in the sense that he says criticism should be open to criticism, and the critical rationalists would often say it can't be logically. Well, Bartley, I think, showed that it could be. But the idea that you can logically argue yourself out of logic, or you can logically argue yourself out of types of logic, degrees of logic. But this always brings us back to the problem, that the thing you're arguing yourself out of must be argued from outside of that particular structure. And if you're arguing, you're using logic. So at some point, there's always some minimal standard of logic in any argument you're making, which must exist beyond argument, which must be presupposed. And if such a paradox could be avoidable, then in fact you'd have to have grounds for doubt in logic itself and rational argument. If in fact this circle could resolve itself in some logical formulation. And again, I'm running in circles there. I do begin to see, and I think it does make sense what Bartley is saying here, but it clearly offers some sort of fodder for his critics, or at least at a face value. Bartley goes on to say here, as nice as it is to think otherwise, and perhaps I should read the quote here, one can no more argue without a minimal logic than one can live without breathing or speaking without language. None of these three, living, speaking, arguing, require irrational commitment to a dogma. I think the central point here, at least to dispel the analogy between the irrationalness that Bartley was pushing back on so hard and what people may accuse him himself of doing here, is just how it plays out in practice. And that is, even if he were to be an irrationalist, even if we were to discover an irrationalist in the world who were to put forward an argument for irrationalism, well, to put forward this argument, you'd have to do so with a minimal standard of logic within the argument. When the irrationalists put forward their original tu quoque argument to the critical rationalists and rationalists, effectively saying, you are irrationalist too, you make irrational leaps, they were doing so on the irrationalist's own terms. It was a way to defeat rationalism, or at least attempt to defeat rationalism, with an internal criticism of rationalism. That's the point, an internal criticism of rationalism. But if you turn this around and say, well, someone who uses logic must be irrationally committed to logic, then that argument that anyone who uses logic is irrationally committed to logic requires logic to make. So it's not internal, it's an external claim about the argument itself, which means that tu quoque argument disappears as well, because neither side is claiming to be able to get rid of this thing. Neither side is claiming something else. Both are recognizing, at least in principle, or at least using in principle, that logic sits outside of arguments, even when those arguments are trying to dispel logic. Some small element of logic must exist outside of it. This runs us back to analogies with Gödel, of course, and his theorems. And of course, there's a wonderful chapter within Miller's book on this, and perhaps I should cover that at some point in the future. But it seems to be an irrefutable fact of the world. But on all things, even though Bartley thinks there's no way around this, Bartley's open. Show him. Open it up. Show Gödel wrong. Show Bartley wrong. Show how you can argue yourself out of a position of argumentation. Show how you can argue yourself out of logic while using logic to do so. Bartley, on all things, is open. Again, he just can't see how it is possible. And I think from here we should launch into chapter 5, simply because it is very short and it does deal with that same question of logic, which, of course, I think, again, ironically doesn't transmit very well over podcasts. Bartley begins the chapter, I think, with his greatest achievement, one he's most proud of, and I think the reason he wrote his dissertation, why he went to see Karl Popper in the first place as a student, and why he wrote this book that we've been speaking about for so long now. And that is, he discovered at the heart of the entire Western philosophical enterprise an authoritarian structure. Not an intentional authoritarian structure. That's important, because a lot of these philosophies consider themselves the opposite of that. They're liberating philosophies. But he says that a lot of this was dragged through, and these philosophers couldn't see that they were retaining an authoritarian structure. And most of them did this by fusing two things together. That is, of course, the idea of criticism with the idea of justificationism. But it does leave open a brief question, and perhaps one worth answering at the very end of the book like this, is why have they been fused in this way? The idea being that there's a derivability here from those authorities. The original understanding, the openly authoritarian philosophies would say that truth comes from authorities. And the ones that Bartley is criticizing here would say, though perhaps they wouldn't say it outright, that we criticize in light of authority. Still a derivability, and still always a justification. And there is a dogma here that holds a lot of this in place. And this becomes really quite interesting, and one of the more interesting things that Bartley has done in his career. I don't think it's central to the claim he's making, but it is very philosophically interesting regardless. And that is, he says there's another dogma at the heart of this entire enterprise. Another hidden philosophical assumption that doesn't need to be there and shouldn't be there. And that is that element of logic which says truth and falsity is transmitted from premises to conclusion in logical argument. That is, they have a relationship and they are logically deducible or derivable. This, in other words, is the transmissibility assumption. The claim is rather a simple one. It looks in different ways from different angles and different formalizations, but really it's that there is a character within the logic itself which is fully transmissible. More often than not, it's a focus on truth and not on falsity, but different formalizations do exist. And Bartley wants to go on to say here that it is something that's been held, and he says here, held with a ferocity that is usually both unexamined and a tenacity which can be explained only through an historical analysis. And it is such a persistent idea that when the criteria for truth proved to be such an unattainable goal, when it simply failed to show up in light of many people's ideas, it simply tended to be replaced by weaker and more attainable measures, such as the search for probability. Now, as it so happens, truth and probability do happen to be transmissible from premises to conclusion through this deducible relationship. That is, for example, anything derived from a true statement must also be true in this logical formalization. But the trouble is that this transmissibility assumption was often simply taken for granted. People tended to assume, unquestionably, that other properties were automatically shared as logical derivatives, or they were logically transmissible in the same way. For example, empirical character, and empirical character therefore being logically transmissible. But it's not. From every possible basic statement, non-empirical statements, non-empirical metaphysical statements, and tautologies always logically follow. And this is the point that Miller used earlier on to defend Bartley against criticisms that all statements ought to be criticizable. And here Bartley wants to free the world of philosophy from one last small point, and that is the full bounds of the transmissibility assumption. He says it's simply not necessary. There are other options, other approaches, other ways where we can evaluate and criticize things. For example, we can test theories and corroborate those theories. The measure or the degree of testability, for example, unlike truth and probability, is not logically transmissible. If a theory of testability, for example, did have the transmissibility assumption, did share this assumption, then any consequence of the hypothesis would have to be just as testable as the hypothesis itself, as the original hypothesis. But as Bartley says and shows, no such thing ever happens. And as Miller wanted to defend Bartley from, it's often the opposite, that the original position is testable, but the statements perhaps produce tautologies that are not testable. Theories do not simply pass on their testability to their assumptions. It's the theories themselves that need testing. And as long as they remain openly testable and to a high level, then that's all that matters. But it's really not about what matters. Logically, this isn't being passed on. And Bartley's going to return here ever so briefly to one of his famous or favorite analyses. And this is this one. He says, all people who dwell in London are English. This is 3 hypotheses, by the way. So the first, all people who dwell in London are English. All people who dwell in Hampstead are English. That's number 2. And all people who dwell in Bloomsbury are English. That's number 3. Now, assuming correctly that both Hampstead and Bloomsbury are in London, as Bartley does, that means that the second and third assumptions follow from the first. They are derivations of it. But Bartley wants us to suppose and look into this a little deeper. He says, suppose that the second statement is falsified. That is, all people who dwell in Hampstead are English proves to be false. Then that means, by the rule of transmissibility, that the first statement ought to be false too. And yeah, it would be true. If Hampstead is in London, and not all people in Hampstead are English, then not all people in London are English. So that seems to make sense at that particular level. But how about this? Suppose that second statement hasn't been falsified, and that the third statement, that all people who dwell in Bloomsbury are English, has never been tested. Now, clearly the first statement would, if it were possible, if we ran the test and it proved to be right, it would be falsified by the third, just as it would be falsified by the second. But the second would not be falsified by the third. If it were not true that all people who dwelled in Bloomsbury were English, then sure, all people that dwell in London are not English. But it might still be true that all people in Hampstead are English. The second and third are logically unrelated, which means that the first statement, all people who dwell in London are English, is more testable, more falsifiable than the second, because the first is falsifiable by the second, but also falsifiable by something that does not falsify the second, which would be the third. Now, this example that Bartley uses here, I think it seems quite elementary, but I think it is important. Because if testability and criticizability is not transmissible in this way, then rationality is free from the enterprise as well. It means it's not justifiable. It doesn't have to hinge upon anything else. Falsifiability is not always derived from something else. So we don't ever have to justify it in terms of something else. Now, of course, the process of testing might be infinite in this regard now. But there's no infinite regress simply because we may go on testing forever. There's no logical infinite regress here because we're not simply deriving testability from testability from testability all the way down. And because the aim to justify the things we say can be abandoned now. We don't need to justify them. We only need to test them, and we can test them on their own grounds, not in light of something else. We don't have to justify that test or justify that criticism by lights of a previous statement or a previous position or a related statement or a related position. The mistake is fairly understandable one, I think, because it's a fairly understandable, or at least a fairly common mistake in terms of Popperian theory or rationality in general and critical rationalism. That is, people really struggle to shake themselves free of the understanding that absolute certain truth is both achievable and the goal of science and rationality. But because testability and corroboration are not transmissible, well, we can get rid of some of these assumptions now. We don't have to play this game. We certainly don't have to fall into the justificationist trap that so much of philosophy has fallen into before Bartley. All you need to accept now is that a non-justificationist, non-authoritarian theory of knowledge, and indeed, of course, rationality, is possible. And Bartley believes it is pancritical rationalism that has made that possible. And before I do leave the final text of the book just there, I think I want to add something ever so briefly about the relationship between Bartley and Popper. I think throughout the series, I've shown them to be quite at odds with each other, and of course they were over a very important issue. And I'm going to add one last podcast at the end of this series, which will come up next, of course, which will show some of the critics of Bartley that I think Bartley never had a chance to get around to criticizing, or at least pushing back upon during his life. I have 4 in mind here. But before I get to that, I think I might just add a little something. There's a certain chapter in Bartley's second book, which is a collection of essays, which he talks about, at least ever so briefly, his relationship with Karl Popper. And it's interesting as well as funny, and I've got a couple of minutes here, and I think I might get into it. So Bartley was an American, and he studied at Harvard. And while he was there, he scanned around his professors, those ones that he speaks about there, like Quine, and tells them that he's thinking of doing his graduate studies in London with Karl Popper. And as he writes here, they all pushed back on him. They all said, this is a terrible mistake, don't do it. Karl Popper is an incredibly difficult man to be around. And he says what was worse is when he ignored them and when he went to London and when he in fact enjoyed studying with Karl Popper, they became incredibly angry with him for enjoying the experience of being around this bitter and angry man as they saw it. When Bartley arrived in London, I think I mentioned this earlier, when he first arrived in London and went to the LSE where Popper was, the registrar tried to give him a different PhD advisor. And she spoke of the importance of this particular advisor and why they'd be so good for Bartley. And Bartley, with tremendous credit to him, told her, if it's not Karl Popper, I'm going to get back on the next flight across, or the next boat back to America. And the next day, he had a new advisor, and that advisor was Karl Popper. But not after being scolded by their registrar for being, again, a difficult man. So 2 difficult men here, and this seems to be a theme with a lot of the students that found themselves in Karl Popper's orbit and enjoyed themselves. But what he says is, as soon as he met Karl Popper, I might quote here, he says, I felt immediately and ever after that I had his whole attention. There was nothing routine about the interview. And this is their first meeting. And he began that first meeting, that first interview, by telling him that he completely disagreed with Bartley's old professors back at Harvard. Bartley then went on to, of course, very shortly after that, attend those famous seminars that Popper held. And he saw Popper doing what Popper was famous for, which was berating the people who were presenting at those seminars, students and invited scholars. And in some people's minds, bullying them into submission. And this is certainly an unpleasant kind of scenario, especially when you look at it in this way. But there was something else that Popper later said to Bartley about this, I think in different tones, but again, I might quote this here. He says, there was nothing easier than to nod sagely at a student and say what the student had wrote or said was interesting, but that's not teaching. That doesn't involve learning. What Bartley found with Popper was something that he originally found back at Harvard as an undergraduate. He found this when writing for The Crimson, which is the famous Harvard newsletter. And Bartley says he found himself connected to culture and an audience and life in a way that he never had been before. He had purpose. He said the problem happened when he went into the lectures, and everywhere, as he didn't feel previously, were boundaries. And he says it's only when he came to London that he rediscovered that sense of purpose he had from writing as a student journalist back in Harvard, and which all the professors around him dragged out of him, dragged the joy from him. Now, the closeness of the two men, I think, can't be understated here. Bartley used to spend a tremendous amount of time with Popper. He used to walk with him everywhere simply to get a greater chance to speak to him and understand him. He used to follow him into doctor's office and on trains and onto buses and on long walks. And that thing that Popper used to do, where he used to speak over people and interrupt all the time, Bartley soon discovered that a lot of that had to do with Popper's deafness. That Popper was deaf and, for some strange reason, shy about it. And the way he got around this, Bartley, was to write Popper long letters before they spoke each time, laying out what he wanted to speak about. And this gave Popper a pre-understanding of the context and just what Bartley would be speaking about, and allowed him to fill in some of the gaps that he couldn't hear. What Bartley found with Popper was what Popper hoped to do and hoped to create when he wrote later on in books like The Unending Quest. And perhaps I should quote Popper here, because Bartley says that at least around Popper, it did feel just like this, that it was a school in which young people could learn without boredom, and which they would be stimulated to pose problems and discuss them. A school in which no unwanted answers to unasked questions would have to be listened to, in which one did not study for the sake of passing examinations. So the opposite of the kind of stultifying atmosphere that Bartley had just found at one of the highest institutions in the world before he'd come across to Karl Popper. It was on one of those long walks with Popper to a doctor's office where the doctor dared to utter some statement about conjectural science, and where Popper launched into a lecture of his own, telling the doctor how all science and all knowledge is conjectural. It's in that moment when Popper actually turned to Bartley after the doctor had left the room in quite a huff and asked Bartley, and I should quote here, "Bill, people say I'm a difficult man. Am I a difficult man?" In which Bartley, Bill Bartley, William Bartley, responded as, "Karl, only a difficult man would ask such a question." And the closeness of student and teacher remained such for an incredibly long time. It was only when Bartley pushed forward with his book, and I think specifically when he called Popper a fightist, that the relationship broke down. He said, Bartley, that he spent 7 years before that with Popper, and he calls him idyllic. And he said they didn't quarrel, once. The words matter. I'm sure they argued all the time. Well, Bartley says they didn't quarrel. And this happened to such an extent that his fellow students teased him about the closeness of their relationship. But then, in 1965, Bartley calls him a fightist. Bartley says there's irrationalism at the heart of critical rationalism, and after which they didn't speak for 12 years. He says the length of the time and the story involved is something for another time. But I think the greatest insight into this disagreement and how serious it was comes from Joseph Agassi, who I will cover later on, about how seriously both men considered their disagreement. And as Bartley writes in this particular book, they had reconciled at this point. Just how they reconciled their philosophies, I don't think they did. And I think a lot of this boils down to a couple of small factors, problematic factors rather. It's Popper. Popper had this principle that he wouldn't argue publicly with his students. So maybe it was okay to call Popper a fightist, just not publicly in the way Bartley did at a conference. But I think even if you imagine that there's some virtue to the idea that we're not going to have our arguments public, we're going to do them in private, it may keep some sense of respect between teacher and pupil and between the colleagues who were around Popper at the time. And it may even feel nicer and more respectful. But what it does do, almost certainly, is give the impression to the outside world that Popperian philosophy is moving and evolving, and not giving proper credit to the people who are forcing the evolution upon Popperian philosophy. I know a lot of people, Agassi for example, eventually felt quite embittered by the fact that they would correct errors within Popperian philosophy Popper would then adopt those changes, and the rest of the world would not be able to acknowledge or not acknowledge, for whatever reason, it was Agassiz who had made the change. And the same is certainly true for William Bartley. I don't think there's been another philosopher out there who has had such an impact upon Popperian philosophy, or has changed it in such dramatic ways as Bartley did. And he certainly did, as you'll see in one of the 4 criticisms that I bring up in the next episode. So for all its virtues as a system, by not hashing these things out publicly, I think Popper was unintentionally taking away credit from his own students. And perhaps that is why there's so many incredible fallings out within the community. But I should leave the podcast here on the note that the 2 men did reconcile, even if their philosophies didn't. And that the impact of Bartley on Popper was only outweighed by the impact of Popper upon Bartley. And I think the central tenet of the book, The Retreat to Commitment, of what Bartley was trying to achieve and what he noticed, I think he did achieve. Certainly in the sense that it revised critical rationalism to the point where it looks like, at least in many people's eyes today, like pancritical rationalism. But all that perhaps better said through the criticism of 4 authors that I will bring in next week. I'll see you then.